The genitive is useless. There's no point to it at all. Everybody just uses the dative instead. Or do they? Let's find out how true this is. Grüß Gott, hallo, schönen guten Tag, ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 2. Herzlich willkommen. So, we've all heard it. Der Dativ ist dem Genitiv sein Tod. You might even have read the book. Spend a bit of time trawling the internet and you'll see these headlines. Everybody just uses the dative instead of the genitive. The genitive is dying out. Today, I want to show you that perhaps we use it a little bit more often than you might think. And at the same time, we'll be thinking about when we actually are meant to be using it. So let's just maybe start off with the question, what is the genitive? Of course, it's one of the 4 cases in German, and we know that German always gives us some kind of indication what the function of a noun is in a sentence, mostly by making some changes to the article, but it also uses different pronouns, adjective endings as well, according to the function of these in a sentence. So what cases are there? Well, we've talked about this before in a few videos, this one and, well, these ones. And we know that there are subjects, the people or things that do whatever the verb says they're doing. And then there are a few objects. We've got direct ones and indirect ones, prepositional objects, that sort of thing. And then there is the genitive. Generally, what you'll hear is that we need the genitive to indicate possession. And, well, look, that's kind of correct. Of course, we're not talking about those situations where we'd say, das ist mein Hund, but where we are saying, well, let me give you some examples. In its easiest form, we can say things like, das ist Christines Hund, das ist Christines Kamera, das ist Christines Geige. And here, since we're using someone's name, we will just use an S on the person's name. And of course, we're not going to be using an apostrophe, are we? Even though you'll often see this used incorrectly in German-speaking countries. Where it gets perhaps a little bit more complicated is perhaps if I didn't want to say that it's Christina's dog, but that it's my wife's dog. And this is the English genitive or the possessive. We're using 2 nouns, one belonging to the other one. And of course, there are other ways of expressing this, but it's worth seeing how we'd express this in German using the genitive, since this is probably something that English-speaking people might want to say and to render in German. And there's a good chance, if they don't pay attention, that they'd get it wrong. So we need to use this structure, where we don't say, this is my wife's dog, but that this is the dog of my wife. This is super important to remember, but maybe you're thinking we could say the same thing with von, and you'd be right. Das ist der Hund von meiner Frau. And can I point out here, it doesn't matter if the dog belongs to my wife, the wife, or just a random wife, the ending will still be the same. And although this isn't the genitive yet, it's actually pretty close to it. But before we get to the genitive, let's look at an example where the dog belongs to a male rather than a female. Das ist der Hund von meinem Bruder. And again, we could say it is the dog of the brother or a brother. The ending doesn't really change. So we've got 2 sentences, and that's all we need to show you what happens in the genitive. If the dog belongs to a female person, we can just get rid of the von and it's already in the genitive. That's all we have to do. Here, this article between the 2 nouns contains the idea of my, in much the same way actually that the dative article often contained the idea of for someone or to someone. Where the genitive gets fancy is in our next example. And this is perhaps where people think we don't use it all that much. If we get rid of the von in this sentence, then we actually need to make some changes, which seems a bit unfair, but hey, it's grammar, what can you do? Here it becomes meines rather than meinem. And for the first time in the history of grammar, the noun gets an S too. The noun gets affected. It was crazy stuff, but it's a bit like what happens in English, isn't it? At this point, I should point out that that's all we need to learn, because feminine and plural are going to behave in much the same way. Masculine and neuter behave in the other way. So let's take a look at some examples before we talk about whether we'd actually bother using any of this. And here we are in a street, well, actually at the end of a street. And since we're at the end of something that is feminine, then we could say, am Ende der Straße können wir nicht weiter. Am Ende der Straße müssen wir umdrehen. If we're at the end of something that's plural, like say the holidays, then we could use the same form. Am Ende der Ferien ist der Spaß aus. Am Ende der Ferien müssen wir wieder arbeiten. And I'd argue that those are both things we would actually say in German. Probably because it's almost like using the dative, just actually a little bit easier because we don't have to bother with that von preposition. It's when the thing is masculine or neuter that we're probably less likely to use it in speaking and informal writing. We live on top of a hill, but I'm less likely to say, wir wohnen am Gipfel eines Hügels, and I'm probably more likely to say, wir wohnen oben auf einem Hügel, just using the dative. Here we are on the beach. In fact, as you can see, we're almost at the end of the beach. So yes, this is an opportunity to use the genitive. And since the beach is masculine, we would say, wir sind am Ende des Strands. Or perhaps we'd say, am Ende des Jahres gibt es einen großen Ausverkauf. Now, I might say that, but it would be just as easy to use the dative, and probably easier, in fact, to say, am Ende vom Jahr gibt es einen großen Ausverkauf. So if the thing that would be in genitive is masculine or neuter, you're probably less likely to use the genitive. But if we're not using an article, then you might often hear things like, wir waren Anfang letzten Jahres in Österreich. And while we're at it, you'd probably hear someone say, das war der schönste Urlaub meines Lebens. Full on genitive right there. Or what about if you want to get a little bit fancier? Das ist meines Erachtens viel zu teuer. And hidden in this common word too is some genitive. Wir sprechen zu Hause größtenteils Deutsch. Größtenteils is genitive. If we're reading books, then there are lots of examples of it. I've grabbed this one at relative random out of my shelf and check out these examples. And of course, there's a whole stack of prepositions where we're meant to be using the genitive. A lot of them have equivalents in English that include the little word of, like these ones, because of, in spite of, and so on. And with these, you'll probably hear people use the dative instead, especially if the thing is masculine or neuter and they are speaking or writing informally. So whereas we may not always say things like, wegen des hohen Preises habe ich das Auto nicht gekauft, Preis is masculine, so we need those S endings. But if we're in the plural, we might say, wegen seiner niedrigen Preise ist Aldi sehr beliebt. That's genitive and it actually sounds okay. Feminine also sounds good in the genitive.
Wegen der Kälte bin ich ganz dick angezogen.
Trotz is another useful preposition that's generally followed by the genitive, or should be. Trotz der hohen Wellen ist der Hund schwimmen gegangen. And here's me in the snow. Trotz des Schnees bin ich in Shorts gelaufen. Here, I think you're probably more likely to hear the dative instead, just so that we can avoid the S's. Trotz dem Schnee bin ich in Shorts gelaufen. So keep an eye out for other situations where we use the genitive, because especially I think with feminine or plural things, we use it quite a bit. And remember, of course, that there's a lot more information in your textbook, Bausteine zwei. So I recommend you check out the examples and exercises in your textbook. And as we say, you'll be an expert in no time. Also das war's dann für heute und auch für dieses Video. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche und weiterhin viel Spaß mit der deutschen Sprache. Und wenn Sie Fragen haben, melden Sie sich einfach. Have a great week. And if you have any questions, just get in touch. Drop a comment down below and we'll see you next time. Auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.